stories. My name is Sarah Henninger, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Thread. We are excited to bring you this new forum for sharing inspiring ideas from exceptional leaders and human beings about the ways in which equity plays out across a variety of contexts, and to demonstrate the power of building intentional relationships across lines of difference to create a more equitable social fabric. At Thread, we believe that relationships are at the heart of change, whether that's individual growth or systemic shifts and everything in between. By building relationships across lines of difference, we believe we can break down the structural barriers that exist and build a society that recognizes the intrinsic value of each and every human being. With this speaker series, we are shining a light on diverse leaders who are models for others on how you can drive sustained change through coordinated and consistent interventions in the intrapersonal, interpersonal, institutional, community, and policy domains. I'd encourage anyone who is unfamiliar with or new to Thread or wants to develop those skills and build deep connections with others in our city to visit our website at thread.org. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We are coming to you from Johns Hopkins University Homewood campus. This speaker series is actually an extension of an undergraduate course at Hopkins, so we do have students in the room with us. And though we are glad to offer this series virtually to our larger Thread and Baltimore community. If you are attending virtually and you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will do our best to answer questions towards the end of the evening. We hope that you'll join us each week for additional discussions, and you can view upcoming speakers and register for additional discussions at thread.events/speakers. Today, we are grateful to be joined by an exceptional business and civic leader, philanthropist, and friend, Marjorie Rodgers Cheshire. Marjorie is the president and chief operating officer of A&R Development, a diversified real estate investment company which owns large-scale multifamily, commercial, and mixed-use properties in Baltimore and Washington markets. Marjorie is responsible for the firm's business operations, asset management, and strategic initiatives, and has held her current position since 2004. Prior to joining A&R, Marjorie spent many years in senior leadership positions in media and sports industries. She was the senior director of brand and consumer marketing for the National Football League, was vice president of business development for Oxygen Media, and served as director and special assistant to the chairman and CEO of ESPN. Early in her career, Marjorie also worked as a consultant for the Boston Consulting Group and in brand management at Nestle Foods. Marjorie is the director and chair of the compliance committee for the PNC Financial Services Group. She also serves as chair of the board of Baltimore Equitable Insurance and is a trustee of the Johns Hopkins Medicine and Johns Hopkins Hospital boards. Marjorie has a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from Stanford University Graduate School of Business. I hope you will join me in welcoming Marjorie.
Thank you, everyone. I am very excited to be here. Thank you, Sarah, so much for thinking of me as a speaker for this series and this course. About 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago, I was sitting in a seat like yours at a prestigious university about an hour north of here, with lauded professors and talented classmates. And I had done all the right things to get there. I had studied hard. I had participated in what felt like 1,000 extracurricular activities, and for about 900 of those, I was in a leadership position. I knew what was expected of me as the daughter of parents raised in the segregated South in the 1940s and 50s, who had gone well beyond their parents in academic and professional success. And in rooms like this, I had opportunities to hear from people who had achieved a great deal of success, entrepreneurs and business leaders who were willing to come and meet with students like me to share their stories. That opportunity would continue again a few years later when I went to business school, where I heard from even more successful people, mostly men, by the way, about their histories and roads to success. And what I've realized in reflecting on having heard those origin stories is that they tend to go something like this. I was raised in certain circumstances, I overcame some kind of challenge. I worked hard, I went to school, I got into a good college, I worked hard, I graduated, I got an entry-level job, I worked hard, I got promoted, someone took a chance on me, they recognized my talent, and then you do those last couple steps a couple more times, worked hard, got promoted, worked hard, got promoted, and then at the end they say, ta-da, I'm standing before you as a successful fill in the blank, whatever that is. That's the person you see today. And that's always how I heard those stories. I've even looked back on how I normally tell my stories, which is a variation of that very same story I just shared. But what I've realized, and what I think is too often missing, and what I'm asked to talk about when I come before groups like this, are what were the mistakes? What were the missteps? Where did you go wrong? It's human nature to discount the things that don't go well at best, or to omit them or repress them, maybe at worst. But by denying ourselves an honest look at our errors, we deny ourselves the deepest part of learning and a chance to really connect with other people. People like me also miss out on really giving you the full benefit of our journey when we water it down, when we tell only the positive parts. And that's the whole point of experiences like this, is hopefully for you to glean something from what my experience has been. So tonight, I'm going to do things a little differently. Yes, I'm going to take you through my background, but I'm also going to try to highlight some key parts of my story, which I sometimes omit. I want to tell you about how I moved from leading my professional life based solely on tradition and conventional thinking to a different way of operating. I call the traditional thinking the world's way. Over time, I really have come to both savor and see the power in leading in a way that reflects broader thinking and alignment really with a deeper version of myself. And I call that leading the wise way. So what do I hope you get out of tonight? My goal is one for you to understand there's another way of approaching your professional life and becoming a leader in the world. That there is a wider frame of reference from which you can draw. 3, that there are always more options and that you always have agency. And finally, that as you develop a broader and wiser way of living your life, it helps you develop the courage to lead in powerful spaces. So back to my story. I grew up not far from here in a town called Columbia, Maryland. And for those of you not from this area, Columbia is a planned community that was founded in the 1960s, late 1960s. My family moved there in the early 70s. As a planned community, Columbia was designed to be racially and socioeconomically inclusive. And I really did experience it that way. I think the inclusivity of the Columbia community informed how I view the world. And I think it informs even how I show up in professional settings today. I grew up steeped in the world of business. My father started a real estate development business when I was 8 years old, and my brother was 2. So the backdrop of my childhood was a family in the throes of the early stage of starting a company. And I say my family was in the throes of that process because when you have a parent who's an entrepreneur, the business is your sibling as the child, right? That it's another child in your family. And it took me years of reflection and a bit of therapy to actually understand that. One of my early memories is standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom with a brush. I don't know if anyone's ever used the brush microphone or the curling iron microphone, but I would interview myself in the mirror and I would pretend to be the CEO of the company. I was once asked in an interview, I was interviewing to join the board of a publicly traded company, and the CEO, the lead director of the company asked me whether I had ever imagined myself achieving the success that I had achieved at that point in my career. And my answer was actually yes. And I didn't say that out of arrogance. I said it because I had a vision for myself, and the vision started with the brush interview in the mirror. And that vision, I now look back and realize, was actually quite clear. My love of business informed my decision to major in business in undergrad, and I went to college at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I did a dual concentration in marketing and entrepreneurial management. In college, I was heavily involved in extracurricular activities, mostly focused on the performing arts, which has always been a love of mine. When it came time to think about a job after college, I wanted a job that combined my interest in business with some aspect of creativity. And so I went after brand management jobs, consumer products marketing. My first job after college was as a junior level consumer products analyst at Nestle Foods. And my first brand was Nestle's Crunch. It was in that job that I discovered that I did really love the blend of business and creative, and that I was fascinated by consumer behavior. After a few years of working, I went back to business school at Stanford. And I had sworn when I left undergrad that I was never going back to school. I'd learned everything I needed to know. And of course, a few years later, I discovered I didn't know everything and that I needed and I wanted more training. I also knew candidly that having an MBA was going to matter for me as a woman of color in corporate America. After business school, I took a job as a management consultant working in the New York office of the Boston Consulting Group. While management consulting turned out to be very good training, I really disliked the job, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. After about 2 years, I made a decision to take a leap and pursue a long-standing interest in the media and entertainment industry. I was looking to return to an industry where I could combine my love of business with my interest in consumer behavior and creativity. So entertainment, as you may know, is one of those really tough industries to break into. Even on the business side, it's hard to get in. I had to do a lot of networking. I used my business school network. I used my undergrad network. And I was patient, and I had to wait a while. But eventually I was able to get a job at the ABC television network in the daytime division. Daytime is soap operas like General Hospital and talk shows like The View. And from there, I had a series of really interesting and challenging and exciting jobs at media companies like ESPN and Oxygen Media and the NFL, which Sarah mentioned in the intro. And at that point, I'd been out of business school probably about 10 years. And I started to question my role in corporate America. I still loved business, but I started to feel siloed and stifled in the jobs that I had. You know, even really cool and glamorous industries like professional football can make you question why you're actually there, believe it or not. I wanted to use more of my skills, and I wanted to run something. And frankly, I felt stymied in the positions that I'd had in the entertainment industry. So as I was exploring, and this was about 2003, it was the first time I started getting quiet when I was wrestling with a decision. I started asking myself questions about what skills I wanted to develop and how I could expand my leadership abilities. So after considering several different paths, I made the decision to return to Baltimore to work with my family's real estate development company. So I left New York, and I left my big, sexy corporate job and moved back to Baltimore in 2004. I joined A&R Development, the company my dad started in 1977. A&R was founded as a real estate development company, and I try to explain real estate development as the hub of the wheel of building a building. So the developer is the part of that process that finds the land, the developer raises the capital or brings the money, they oversee the design and the construction, and then they're charged with developing a building that is both financially sound and physically sound, right? If you don't get it right in real estate development, buildings fall down. So it's risky business and it's very capital intensive. And by joining A&R, my family's business, I got what I wanted and needed at that point in my career. I was forced to use the business skills and the leadership muscles that I had not used to that point. The things I read in case studies in business school, but had never approached using, I had to use. My job was no longer siloed and specific to a department. And most of all, if I didn't perform well, It had a real impact on the organization, on the culture, and on the livelihoods of the people who work there. You know, the thing I told people about working at the NFL and about working for any large company versus working for a small company is this. When I went to the NFL, if I didn't show up for work one day, every game got played on Sunday, right? Nothing stopped. It was a machine. When you work at a small organization, when you don't show up or when you don't perform, it actually matters. And there's a huge difference between those two dynamics and the pressure that comes from that. So in the midst of building my career, I met my wonderful husband, Mark, and we had a daughter, Ellison. So at that point, I was balancing a demanding work life, I had a family life, and all of that was rewarding, but added a whole nother dimension to who I was as a person. So in moving back to Baltimore, one of the things I hadn't expected that would be presented to me was the opportunity to serve on boards. I now chair the board of a 228-year-old insurance company based here in Baltimore. I'm on the board of PNC Bank, which is the 7th largest bank in the country. And I'm on the board of Exelon, which is the largest utility in the country and serves 10 million customers. I also serve on the board of Johns Hopkins Medicine and Johns Hopkins Hospital, so we have that in common. I wanted to spend a few minutes discussing board work for 2 reasons. One, I'm really passionate about board work. I describe myself as a board nerd. I love governance and I love participating in the process of governing companies. But the other reason I want to talk about it is because corporate boards are really one of the highest realms of power in this country. And this is a place where I'm putting all of the skills that I developed over the course of my career to work, in environments where it's pretty high stakes. So a little bit about boards. Every publicly traded company has a board. Most large and medium-sized companies have active independent boards, and most nonprofits have boards. The role of a board is to set strategy for a company. And it's also to provide oversight of the management team, the people who are running the company day to day. The board answers to the shareholders, to the owners of the company. And the board has a legal duty to watch out for the interests of the shareholders and other stakeholders. So to put it really simply, the board is the boss of the CEO. To give you a sense of scale, though, let's look at the Fortune 500, which are the 500 largest companies by revenue in this country. So in 2021, there were about 5,900 board seats in the Fortune 500. And I say board seats because some people hold more than one seat. So I have 2 board seats in the Fortune 500. So the concentration of people is actually smaller. It's actually tighter than 5,900, but there are 5,900 seats. In those same companies, the same 500 companies, there are 29 million employees. So there are 5,900 people governing the work lives of 10% of the American population. And those 5,900 board seats oversee aggregate sales of $14 trillion, which is 2/3 of the GDP of this country. So you've got a group of people governing the 500 largest companies in the US, which is smaller than the undergrad population of Hopkins. So that just gives you a perspective and a sense of the power and the concentration of power in the corporate America. Boardrooms tend to be made up of people who are powerful in the industries that they come from, and these people tend to be very accomplished. It's important to know that while being on the boards of most nonprofits is a volunteer role, it's a paid position in for-profit companies often, and in public companies almost always. A corporate boardroom is a space, frankly, that few people understand and few people will ever get to see. The corporate boardroom really is the power center of commerce in this country. So I say all that again to say how I show up in those spaces has real impact on the policies and the practices of companies of which I am on the board. Okay, end of my background. So you may think from that I have it all figured out. You have heard my story, certainly condensed for the sake of time. And even when I tell it, I remark on how it sounds like a tale of hard work and good schools, good connections, and some luck. And it is all of those things. Those elements are real, and they are the key building blocks of the success that I have enjoyed. But those years, those work years, were also years of often not listening to myself, of trying to exert power in ways that weren't natural to me, and of trying to move up in the business world in all the ways I was told I should, but in ways that sometimes didn't fit me. About 5 years ago, I started wanting to do things differently. My mom had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. My brother had left our family business, and our business at that point was almost 40 years old, and I was faced with the question of what I wanted it to be in its next phase. My husband and I were raising our daughter, and in that, I found I was reflecting on how I wanted to show up as a mom, as a role model, and how I wanted to be intentional about the next phase of my career. So you're going to have options about how you approach your professional life. You can, as many people do, as I did for a long time, kind of do it the world's way, where you can move towards a way that reflects your own authentic sense of self. Again, the wise way. For me, as I moved into operating my professional life in the wise way, I found my own power, and it was hiding in plain sight. So a little bit more about what I call the world's way and the wise way. The world's way to me represents the rules that we're taught get us ahead and make us successful in the world. They are the messages, overt, modeled, and implied, that we get from the time we are young, and they continue with us through childhood. They're the messages that launch us into the world and carry us through our professional life. So why do I call it the world's way? So I think the world's way is really a collection of social agreements and beliefs about what success is. And those beliefs tend to be one-dimensional and rigid often. They're traditions that go largely unexamined or go unchallenged. So this conventional thinking can be deceiving because it's like a double-edged sword. There's really real utility in these skills and that way of living. But without balance, without understanding that the skills that you have to be used in the context of broader wisdom, they can cut you. I think high performers, and I was one of them, and I think you, our group of high performers, are even more susceptible to the pitfalls of the world's way. I think we as high performers are rewarded for staying on the success path. We've been told since we were little that that was the way. And since almost everyone else is doing it, naturally we continue to exhibit those behaviors. Even when something in us tells us that our path or choices are out of integrity with who we are, or something just feels off, we can ignore those signals. We keep on marching down the path, and we call that path the road to success. So I was going to give you a couple of examples of what I have experienced as the world's way in specifics, and the way that I've tried to navigate that into the wise way. So world's way number one, the belief that I can will myself to get through anything. So this is the high achievers mantra: mental discipline, tenacity, hard work, discipline. I can set a goal, I can use focus, grit, and intellect, and I can get through it. I was really good at this one. And yes, you can get through it. The question becomes, do you want to? The problem with this worldview is that it ignores several important things. One of them I will focus on today, and that is that we often don't realize that the choices that we're making come from voices that belong to other people, or they can be beliefs passed down from our tribe. So what do I mean? Is the voice telling you you should do something, is that your mom's voice? Is it your dad's voice? Is it a kid from middle school who gave you a hard time? Or does it go even further back? Are you trying to prove something because you're trying to be loyal to a family heritage? And let's give an example. Everybody in my family becomes a lawyer. Might be something someone says. That might be loyalty to a family heritage that's getting passed on. Or are you trying to disavow something because you desperately want to get away from something in your history? So what this can sometimes sound like in your head, or what it sounds like sometimes in my head, is things like this. If I do this, this will make them so proud. I'll show them. I'm really good at the proof one. I'll prove it. I'll show them. I really should do this. So an example of how this showed up for me in my professional life. When I was in my second year of business school, and I started thinking about what I wanted to do afterwards, I was really interested in the media industry. But I also had this really strong need to prove that I could get one of the competitive jobs that business school graduates coveted at the time. So when I came out of business school, the really hot jobs, the competitive jobs were investment banking and management consulting. This was before hedge funds and big tech. Back in the day, it was investment banking and management consulting. And as I described earlier, I had done marketing before business school. And I was told by some people, and frankly, including my own dad, who I deeply admired, that marketing wasn't as rigorous as some other professions. So I had it in my head that I wanted to be a consultant and that I wanted to prove that I could do it. And I got the job. I was hired by one of the top 2 consulting companies in the country. And I took my nice signing bonus, nice salary, and I moved to New York City. So here was the issue. I really disliked it. Management consultants go into companies and get paid to help them solve business problems. And I love solving problems. But I also loved being in the business. I loved being part of the team. I liked being in operations. And in consulting, you're none of those things. You're a hired advisor. Come in, you solve a problem, and you get out. You don't implement anything. You don't hang out with the team, the management team. And truth be told, I really wasn't great at it. And this is the part of the story I never tell. I was not good at it. Most likely because I didn't enjoy it. I was actually told by my manager in my second year being a consultant that, get this, he told me I was not strategic. Now I'm working at a strategy consulting firm and I was told I was not strategic. I mean, talk about the ego blow of hearing that, right? I just graduated from this fabulous business school and I'm working at this big company. And for years after that, I genuinely questioned whether I was a strategic thinker. And I'll tell you something, 3 weeks ago, I was working on a problem of strategy for one of the boards that I'm on. And I had a millisecond of thinking, am I strategic enough to actually solve this problem? I mean, it's still there. These things are powerful, right? So the wise way, and I think where your true power comes from, is recognizing that your history, both what's known to you and what is unknown, is influencing your choices, and that your choices may not actually be your choices. The key here is recognition. Just pausing to ask yourself, where a belief you have actually comes from can be everything. Remember what I mentioned earlier, trying to recognize whose messaging you're getting about something? Can you hear someone else's voice attached to your inner monologue? Once you slow it down and examine it, you can begin to recognize that inner voice, and the inner voice is usually critical. It's not usually cheering you on. It's something it's usually saying something sort of negative or pressuring. And recognize that it comes from another influence in your life. And once you see that, you're empowered to make a conscious choice versus continuing on automatic pilot down the world's path. So, world's way number 2. Some experiences or people are a waste of time. So what this sounds like in your head could be things like this. I just flew 3 years on this job and I never got promoted. I switched majors and I wasted so much time. I feel like I'm starting over. So having just told my story about taking this job in consulting, this is an important one to discuss because it's almost like paradox. It seems contradictory. As part of the worldview that tells you that things have been a waste of time, there's a belief that's important to stay on the productive path, which to our minds looks like a nice, smooth 45-degree line up. When we make decisions or when people or situations are thrust upon us that we perceive as negative or toxic or painful, we feel like we've wasted our time. The decision to choose consulting was not deeply examined on my part. As I said, I was acting out old, outdated expectations of myself and misplaced expectations of others. But importantly, it was hardly a waste of time. The wise way to think about this is the following. Everything and everyone in your life is a teacher. I learned a ton as a consultant. I spent time in boardrooms with CEOs as a very junior member of the team. I now look back and realize that there was some foreshadowing for my work as a board director today. I was humbled, and painfully so, by having my strategic thinking questioned. But it also helps me remember what it's like to struggle in a position. So now that I'm in an executive role, I stop to think about fit rather than just judging someone else's intelligence, which is sort of the easy, lazy thing to do sometimes. Is this individual performing below expectations simply because they're in a job that doesn't light them up, or a job that doesn't utilize their strengths? That early experience in consulting made me a better manager. Think about the importance of that 5,900 people that we talked about. If those people are starting to think differently about evaluating the performance of leaders, how powerful that can become. There's always something to be learned or gained. You may have hated the class you took, but made a really good friend. The summer job that you found incredibly boring may have gained you a marketable skill. Life is always giving you gifts along the way. You just have to really be on the lookout for them. And the world's way will have you burn up a lot of time and energy with regret. That regret over a bad experience just creates a vicious cycle because it simply extends and magnifies the sense of wasted time. So take the lesson, try to let the rest go, and if you find yourself ruminating, give yourself a little bit of grace. World's way, number 3. High achieving leaders make good decisions because they're technical, rational thinkers, and intuition is just a soft skill. So in the realms of business and academia, technology, and science, among others, we have a tendency to really be awed by technical achievement, and for good reason. There are gifted technical thinkers working on innovation and solving some of the most pressing and difficult problems that we have today. But I think our fixation on rational and technical thinking has caused us to discount the importance of gut and intuition in the creative processes involved in all of those disciplines. And all of them have a creative process in them. So for the first 2 examples of the world's way, I talked about what it might sound like in your head. For this one, I'm going to talk about the behaviors that might show up. So one of the behaviors, one that I was really attached to, was the endless reviewing of pros and cons, positive and negatives, grinding on a decision. I was told many times I had analysis paralysis, right? I just could go and go and go, keep thinking about it. Another way it might show up is panicking in a moment. The moment could be a conversation and a negotiation and an interview where you realize you didn't prepare for a particular outcome. You can't prepare for everything. There are going to be moments when you're just going to have to rely on that sort of inner sense of knowledge and intuition. The wise way means understanding that intuition is the secret sauce of leadership. It is a broader way to perceive the world. And think of it as a wider frame of intelligence. I looked up the formal definition of intuition, and it's this: an ability to understand or know something without needing to think about it or use reason to discover it. As you move through life, the wise way is to be able to trust that innate ability and combine it with your experience as a way to guide you. The world's way leans very heavily on rational thinking and experience and dismisses intuition. Now, don't get me wrong. Intuition is not like magical powers where you come and you wave your wand and you don't study for an exam or prepare for a job interview. That's not the way it works. High performers, of course, are well prepared and have years of experience. And they start learning the fundamentals of their craft and they build up to expertise. You can't just pop in with intuition and want to be the president of the company. However, most people that you see operating at high levels anywhere are using intuition as a guide. Some of them don't recognize it. They might say, oh, I think quickly, or they might call it gut and not really examine what that means, but it is intuition. Albert Einstein said, this is a great quote, "All great achievements of science must start from intuitive knowledge. At times I feel certain I'm right while not knowing the reason." He also said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred fit, and the rational mind is a faithful servant," which I think is really powerful. I love that. For Einstein, the intuitive mind is about fit, and the rational mind is the servant. And if you like hearing it more from a poet, Toni Morrison said, "As you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think." I once watched the CEO of a large company in the process of making a really significant strategic decision. The strategy he was launching was substantial and it was risky. And ultimately, the change that he made cleared the way for another important acquisition that would allow the company to grow. And he told me one day in confidence that he thought he'd made the right decision, but what kept him up at night was the question of whether he'd done it at the right time. How did he know when to move forward? How did he press through the decision, even in moments of doubt? Understanding the technical underpinnings of his business was critical, but knowing how and when to make the move, I would argue that was intuition. With me, I was always considered sensitive as a child. I felt things deeply and I could be emotional, but I could also read people and situations well. And being sensitive was something I was told was not helpful in life, particularly in the business world. So I spent years trying to be more rational and more thick-skinned. But I've learned to develop my intuition and embrace it in the last few years. And what I've realized is that same quality of being sensitive shows up as my superpower now. I can feel when a meeting's going off the rails or when somebody's disengaging. I trust that sensitivity, which is my intuition at work. It gives me the courage to speak up in a meeting at a time when it's fraught and it feels risky. But I have a sense of when to press something or maybe even when to back off. I've started naming my intuition in meetings, and I also name other people's intuitions. And I mean, like high-powered, very technical people, I'll name their intuition because I think it's important that we start to respect and own this as part of our intelligence. All right, world's way number 4, last one. Always be a person of action. And we live in a society that loves people to act and respond quickly. We love surety. We love voices that sound authoritative. We focus on answers often before we've really even defined the question. We admire people of action. What that can sound like. If I don't respond to this quickly, they're going to think I don't know the answer. The best way to deal with a problem is to take it on quickly and decisively. The wise way embraces that stillness is fuel. Wise people use regular stillness to reflect and to recharge and to allow the answers to problems to come to them. That can look like regular meditation practice, a long run, a walk in nature, driving even without your car radio on, just giving yourself a little stillness. It's a radical act of self-compassion to give yourself stillness and time. Here's a quick story about how I inadvertently used stillness to my advantage. So for years, our company never sold assets. We would build buildings and then we would own them for long periods of time. The first time we decided to sell a group of buildings was my first big commercial real estate transaction. And I had no idea what I was doing. The buyer owned a company that bought and sold assets all the time. And he was the quintessential real estate deal guy. He was cocky, he was blustery, he was kind of a hothead. And I was a bundle of nerves because I'd never done this. So I used the tools I had. I relied on the people around me for advice. I asked a lot of questions. I read and reread documents. I prepared. I did what I knew how to do. But at one point, late in the negotiations, I realized I'd left something important out that was going to expose our company if I didn't get it included. So we're on a conference call with like 6 lawyers who all make $1,000 an hour. It's myself and the buyer. And I brought it up. And the buyer went bananas. He screamed at me. He lost it. He accused me of trading. He went on and on about how unprofessional I was for bringing this up at the last minute. And I was so intimidated that I didn't know what to do. So I just sat there. And I just let it be silent. And it was silent for like 30 seconds. And I didn't speak because I didn't know what to say. But I also, in that 30 seconds, realized I was better off using the stillness and the silence than trying to take it on. So I just let it sit there. And after about a minute, and it was a long minute, I said, "Are you quite finished?" I had used the silence for my benefit and his tantrum against him. He felt so foolish. It was very clear he felt, and this was on a phone, it was pre-Zoom, but you could hear it in his voice, and he started backpedaling and apologizing, and then he conceded to what the provision I asked for, and it was amazing. The story may make me sound like some kind of negotiation genius, which I clearly was not. My silence came from not knowing what to do, but I was also not afraid to let the stillness be and the silence be. I allowed it to work for me. So as I close, a couple of suggestions on how to do this, because when people come before me and talk and they don't give me how, it drives me a little bit crazy. So I'm gonna give you a couple of quick tips about how I think about moving from the world's way to the wise way. Number one, slow things down. Yes, act with urgency when it's called for, but resist the urge to feel rushed. You know, you guys were all brought up in an instant response culture. I found that most decisions are better when you put a little time between stimulus and response, between question and answer. You know, I like to actually visualize myself driving over a speed bump, just that kind of hump in the road that gets you to slow down. And so if you have to pause for a few minutes or a few hours or a few days, do that. It'll give you time to remember you've got multiple options. It'll give you time to hear your intuition. Second thing, pay attention to how something actually feels. And the key here is moving from thinking to feeling, because we're all good thinkers, right? So when you pause to envision, let's say, the summer job opportunity, how does it actually feel? I mean, does your jaw get tight? Does your throat get tight? Do you get a wave of excitement? Do you feel nothing? That's all valuable information, and it gets you out of that ruminating thinking posture and into a sense of your intuition. Last thing, follow what my friend Vanessa Loader calls energetic breadcrumbs. Energetic breadcrumbs are little clues about what makes you feel aligned with yourself. They naturally guide you towards activities and people and places that emphasize your natural strengths and bring you joy. So like Hansel and Gretel and the breadcrumbs, you have to pay attention to notice them, but they lead you out of the woods. Breadcrumbs can be impulses, they can be good feelings, they can be feelings of excitement. And the visual of breadcrumbs always reminds me that life is not usually revealed in big aha reveals, right? They're not these lightning bolt moments. Life is about little things sprinkled on the path that gets you where you're going. So you guys are all going to work incredibly hard and leave Johns Hopkins with incredible credentials. You'll have broadening experiences, you'll have resumes that'll, light up the world. You'll meet talented people who become part of your network. And these are the fruits of places like Johns Hopkins. Just remember that what can separate you from your peers, and more importantly, will allow you to access more joy on your journey, will be your ability to tap into the wise way. The wise way ultimately is about stepping into your own sense of power and agency. It allows you to act more courageously for yourself and to be a sustainable resource for other people as you become the next generation of leaders. And as you move into your own realms of influence, I urge you to give yourself and the world that gift. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I've been looking forward to tonight for a very long time, and to see you share those examples of being in your power and how you got there is, well, I have a lot of questions, and so does the class and folks joining virtually. maybe a place to start is, one of our students was just wondering, is being on a board like a part-time job? Or how do you get on a board? So maybe we could start at, because I've never been in a Fortune 500 boardroom. I think most people are not part of 5,900. So could you kind of walk us through a little bit, like, what is the job like? What is the day in a life? Or and then how do you actually get onto a board? And what do you do once you're there?
So boards typically meet 4 to 5 times a year for a few days at a time. There are committee meetings, and then there is a full board meeting in those sessions 4 or 5 times a year. There's a lot of work in between. There's a lot of preparation for those meetings. And then there are often meetings, virtual meetings now these days, in between the cadence of the quarterly or 5-time-a-year meetings. How you get on a board is typically through networking. It's typically through relationships that get developed, through jobs that you have, through people you know, through your professional network. There are recruiters that do place people on boards, but traditionally most people are coming onto boards because they know people who are already on boards. So it is one of those things that it's kind of somewhat about who you know. In the last few years, particularly since the summer of 2020, there's been a far greater emphasis on diversifying boards. There was a big move to diversify from a gender perspective. And in the last few years, there's been a big pressure to and a movement to diversify boards on the issues of race. And so that's, I think, begun to open things up a little bit wider within that group, which I think has been a huge boon. And there's so much data on the importance of diversity on boards and to the performance of the companies. And so it's very important that we continue to keep pressure on that. What do? You really are becoming as expert on the strategy of the company as you can be. You're there to make sure that management is making the right decisions for the company. So you're meeting with the management team, you're hearing about what's going on in the organization, and really you're there to ask critical questions. The most important job of the board, as I mentioned, is to be the boss of the CEO, which means that your real critical job is hiring and firing, if necessary, the CEO. And so there's a lot of discussion about succession planning, who will be the next CEO over what period of time, and what does the company need to do to prepare for that. So that's a little bit of what the board does.
I'm curious. So you've gone through a number of examples, I think, in the intrapersonal, like understanding yourself and where your power comes from and how to walk out the wise way. Has there been a relationship, we talk a lot about relationships across lines of difference, and has there been a relationship on a board that you've sat on that has been across a line or multiple lines of difference that has kind of shaped you or shaped how you show up in that space?
Well, yes. And so let me think of, I'll talk about in the wake of to the summer of 20 and the social unrest of 2020. That was a real critical moment in my relationships with other board directors, because the way people of different backgrounds, of course, were experiencing that event was very different. So as a Black woman on a board, I was experiencing and having a lot of personal grief, processing that as a member of the Black community. And that was different than my white colleagues. And I found essentially that I came forward and I shared a lot of personal stories with my fellow directors in order to try to help them understand what their employees were going through, what their other stakeholders might be going through. And those were vulnerable moments for me. I think what came out of that was on my boards, a lot of important forward movement for the organization, but it also solidified the relationship, because the intimacy that gets developed when you have to have a tough conversation across racial lines, it galvanizes the relationship. And so I think it's not specific to one person. It was in that moment in time. I think having to go through that as a diverse organization, it was a moment in the trenches for a board. And I think across lines of difference, that was critically important.
Curious, when we think about it then at like the institutional level or even policy level, do you feel like there are structural barriers that are in the way to like walking the wise way? Like, are there things that make it harder, not just the implicit and explicit messages that we get from how we're raised in our family, but are there structural things that you would perceive as or experience as barriers to slowing down or to really seeing the value of all people?
It's a great question. Yes, I think do people who come from diverse backgrounds have the luxury of taking certain risks in behavior that others do? Answer probably no. And yet I think it's important that we do it. And I certainly think it's important that people in my position do it so that I can demonstrate to people who are in the organization at lower levels that it's okay to do that. Because if I don't take the risk, then it's going to be much harder for someone in middle management or someone who's at the entry level to take the risk. But do I think that my attempts to walk the wise way, that a peer of mine who is not from a diverse background might have more latitude to pursue that? Yeah, the answer is probably yes.
Interesting. I'm curious, one of the things that struck me in listening to you was, as an entrepreneur with an only child, realizing that, oh, she does have a sibling, and I had never thought of it that way, but I bet if we asked her, she would agree. I'm curious with your daughter, how has kind of coming to this understanding of the world's way and the wise way changed how you're engaging her and how you think about being a parent? And because I think intentionally and unintentionally as parents, we absolutely shape the mental model that our children walk into the world with. Just curious how that has changed how you think about being a mom.
Yeah, great question. Well, my husband and I talk about, we don't talk about it in the same construct I described it in today, but we talk about it quite a bit. And I think that it's, we're trying to allow our daughter to listen to that intuition and that sense of her own knowledge of herself and make decisions at this stage of her life. My daughter will be 13 in December, but to learn to trust it. And for us to say, we trust that if you're listening to yourself, we're here to be guides of that experience, but we don't know you better than you know yourself. And I think that the work I've done and the experiences I've had have given me the courage to parent in that way.
So teaching her how to feel, not just to analyze.
Yes, and to not have to not think as the parent that I can make decisions always that are better than she can make for herself.
So how does that translate then when you think about like your journey in management to how you then would engage a CEO of a company, or that you sit on the board, or someone you work directly with? That same way of thinking about how do you get to the balance of the feeling and the analyzing?
Well, that's why I talked about naming. People are already doing it. They just, you can see them overriding it. You can see somebody kind of tapping into intuition or a hunch, and then but they don't want to call it that because they think that it's going to sound too squishy. So then they come up with all these, kind of analytical reasons to support it. And so that's why I try to name it. And I might say, it sounds like your intuition is this. And then to hear a CEO parrot that back and say, you know what, you're right, that is my intuition, then gives everybody else in the room permission to think, oh yeah, you know, it's okay to express a hunch, a gut. I mean, we're all using it. It's just I don't think we name it, and I don't think we give it kind of its full due.
I'm curious, when you started talking about intuition, I thought the scientist in me starts coming at it in a very, I was trying to feel, but I was in an analytical headspace of, you know, our brains are built to recognize patterns and patterns in the data set that we've experienced. So we go throughout life and we experience data set. I'm curious if you think intuition is something that's hardwired or is actually something that is a reflection of all of the lived experiences that then become intuition because that's the pattern your brain pulls from it.
Well, that's why I was making the point about people who think they think fast, that it's a data, that it's really the ability to have so much lived experience and process that data quickly that it gets you to an answer fast, and you then think that's intuition. I think intuition is just something else entirely. I just think it's in another realm of intelligence. And I know the scientist in you is probably grappling with that.
Yeah, I'm learning from you. I'm always learning from you, which I appreciate quite a bit. I think we can have time for maybe one or two more questions. If folks, I want to open it up if there are questions.
I have a question. What are you reading? What is the book that you have found to be most impactful?
Ooh, boy, I read a lot. You know, I often recommend a book called Necessary Endings. That is, I'm trying to think of the author, Henry Cloud. And the book is about knowing when something needs to be over. And it kind of goes to the point I was making earlier about tenacity and stick-to-itiveness and the things that I think we're often rewarded for as high performers. He talks about knowing how to understand that it's okay to walk away from something, when it's okay to walk away, what the signs are that something is not working. I mean, he likens it to, you know, pulling a tooth where you have a cavity. You know, something may be painful, but it may be the healthy choice to actually have it be over. And I read it about once a year because it's helped me with things like walking away from a bad partnership in real estate, or we sold the division of a company because it was time for that to be over. And that was a really, really tough decision. But for just understanding that endings can be good things was helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that goes along with your first point of not trying to will yourself through anything. And I think that is a very hard lesson to learn. Many of us, I don't know if you've ever had shingles, but that my first real lesson with like, I can will myself through, but maybe don't want to will myself through is when your body tells you.
When your body
you
speaks
cross
to
it,
you.
your body speaks to you and you're not
Yeah.
listening clearly enough. So well, I just want to say thank you. It has been just deeply appreciate you coming and sharing with everyone your journey, and I admire you so much, and in awe of all of the things you've accomplished, but also just like who you are as a human, and feel fortunate to know you and to be able to hear all of these very wise lessons from you. So thank you, and appreciate everyone for joining. And I hope you will see us next week. We will be joined by Chris Wilson, who is an artist, advocate, and author. So look forward to seeing you again.